This guy explained this exact thing perfectly to dumbass
we
Piers
get told
Morgan.
time and again, look, it's all very well you middle-class white people telling us what the problem is, right? You're not middle-class and you're not white. What is the problem and how do we deal with this?
Well, as I've said many times before, the social indicators, I don't say causes because obviously there's still an element of personal responsibility. The social indicators for violent crime among young working-class street gangs have remained consistent for 200 years. Relative poverty, masculinity, exposure to domestic violence, lack of education. So the solutions are fairly obvious in many ways. Glasgow, which was once dubbed the most violent city in
Turbo Killer, Silbon, thank you for the 10 get the subs. Turbo Killer, thank you for the 5 get the subs. Beachosaurus Rex, thank you for the 5 get the subs.
Europe, still has a higher murder rate than London. But when we look at serious youth violence, which is my preferred term, if journalists want to be taken more seriously, they should use the term serious youth violence because knife crime has become a sort of racial buzzword at the moment. Glasgow has seen a dramatic reduction in serious youth violence to the point that none of the murders of teenagers that occurred in 2017 occurred in Scotland. What approaches did they take in Glasgow? They took a public health approach, they took an interagency approach, they took an approach that saw violence in a holistic way. They saw the link between domestic violence and violence in the street. They saw the link between violence in society in general and violence in the street. They looked at early interventions, basically, coming into young people's lives and families' lives as early as possible and diverting them away from crime. Good education, good jobs, counselling. That was so dramatically effective. So the fact that there's all this hand-wringing and suggestion that an entirely different set of policies should be suggested for London, maybe Birmingham and Manchester.
So let me put this to you.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting, your view of this. And what I would say to you is this. Statistically, it looks like in London...
Only on this fucking planet in a country like the UK or in a country like the United States, which have very similar qualities, do you have someone who is openly talking about empirical evidence and offering advice and using examples that have been successful and still getting met with like frustrated replies. It's just like, it's not a viewpoint, it's not an opinion, it's just the truth. And this isn't news to us. Like, crime's relationship with socioeconomic conditions or material conditions has been around since ancient fucking Greece. There has never been like there has never been a more clear result. You know, surely there are other factors that you must consider. Absolutely. Like if you want to talk about mass shootings, guns are going to be a thing that you need to cover, right? But here, there's knife crime, right? Violent crimes happening in the UK. But it's always the same exact solution. And yet people refuse to recognize it. It's poverty.
Yeah.
Right now, this is predominantly a problem of young black teenage boys who are members almost exclusively of gangs attacking each other. So that the perpetrators and the victims appear to be almost exclusively young black men. Do you think there is a racial element to that in terms of any cultural issues, racial issues? Or do you think it's the same?
That's crazy. Piers is like, bro, come on, say some racist shit to me, please. Come on, black man, say some racist ass shit, please. That confirms my suspicions, you know?
Where they were white, but actually the race part of this is something that we might look at the statistics and think it's a black problem when it's not.
Okay, so there are several regions of the country, let's just look at the facts, that have higher murder rates than London does. Clearly, throughout human history, black people have not had anything remotely resembling a monopoly on violence. Over the last few years, some of the most horrendous knife attacks, both the victims and the perpetrators have been white, and they've not been from London.
Wait, there's got to be a wait, I want to see more. I want to see more. I want to see the second part of this. Please, the full vid. Okay. Rapper Akala.
We get told time and again, look, it's all very well you middle class, exclusively young black men, to use this. Statistically, black teenage boys who are members almost exclusively of gangs attacking each other. So that the perpetrators and the victims appear to be almost exclusively young black men. Do you think there is a racial element to that in terms of any cultural issues, racial issues? Or do you think it's the same problem they had in Glasgow, where they were white, but actually the race part of this is something that we might look at the statistics and think it's a black problem when it's not?
Okay, so there are several regions of the country, let's just look at the facts, that have higher murder rates than London does. Clearly, throughout human history, black people have not had anything remotely resembling a monopoly on violence. Over the last few years, some of the most horrendous knife attacks, both the victims and the perpetrators, have been white.
The person I unbanned is probably a fucking a foot soldier. H3 users love memeing and saying, talk about the allegations. That's the way that they, like, troll, but not in a bad way. Okay, that's why I unbanned them. Okay.
And they've not been from London.
Like, their first message in the chat literally was, talk about the allegations. This is what the H3 people say as a
including
joke.
A 13-year-old girl stabbed to death in Southampton, a 16-year-old stabbed to death in Dinnington, a 7-year-old girl stabbed to death in York, a 5-year-old stabbed to death by its own mother in Oxfordshire. When both the perpetrator and the victims are white, race suddenly becomes unimportant. There is one limited sense in which race may be important. You could argue that only a very particular demographic of young black boys, only at a very particular stage in their lives, feel a degree of psychological self-hatred or contempt for themselves that they project onto other people who most remind them of themselves. However, the black-on-black violence paradigm, so-called, is never used in that way as a kind of psychological self-hatred model. It's used to give the public essentially the ridiculous impression that black school teachers, black doctors, black lawyers, black Premier League footballers, my grandmother, David Adjaye, Oswald Boateng, are all sort of an equal risk of violent crime. And actually,
well, it reminds me a little bit. I mean, it's different, but it's interwoven slightly into what happened in New Zealand, where you have this white supremacist committing an act of horror. Had he been an ISIS terrorist, the immediate reaction from many people would have been, this is a Muslim problem. Because he's a white supremacist, I've not heard people say, this is a white person problem.
Well, precisely. We have...
It's funny because, like, this is what Piers Morgan does well. He didn't say anything wrong. He didn't say anything wrong. He didn't say anything wrong. You guys need to understand, this is always how Piers Morgan operates, okay? He's very good at, like, bringing up super fucking reactionary talking points without assuming them in many instances, and always maintaining the illusion that he's, like, somewhat center-right when he's, like, literally fucking far-right. He's agreeing with him. He's saying, like, we don't see this as, like, a widespread white person problem. We see this as, like, extremist ideology. He's right. He's right about that. He is correct.
I have enough trouble getting what I'm going to call the racial virtue signaling right-wing press to call white supremacists terrorists by their proper name, let alone to force all white people to explain the bad actions of all other white people. For example, you will never be called upon to explain that not all middle-aged white men are pedophiles, despite the fact that hundreds, maybe thousands of them are convicted of sex offenses.
I love that line. Oh, this guy's fucking awesome.
Because it's self-evident that not all middle-aged white men are pedophiles.
I think it's a completely valid point. I do.
Let's look at it in the other sense. Where young black boys overachieve, is race offered as an explanatory factor? For example, British, Ghanaian and Nigerian boys on free school meals, so the poorest sector, academically outperform and are more likely to go to university than similarly poor white, mixed race and black English kids whose grandparents came from the Caribbean. The 4 youngest children in Britain to ever take GCSEs are all black. Romari Wilfred, a young black boy from East London, has a higher IQ than Einstein. Young black men are more disproportionately represented in professional football than any other area of British life, with all of the consequences and implications that has for their contribution to the tax base, etc. So it's almost as if a black person does something negative, the entire so-called black community is to blame. Black person does something positive and they suddenly regain their humanity and their right to be viewed as an individual. What I'm saying is I'm not just talking about what I read in sociology books, I'm talking about what I saw in my real life.
But here's a tough question for you.
Last point about London, sorry. In the last 2 years, it's still important to remember that the overwhelming majority of murders have not been committed by teenage black boys. So, for example, in 2017, there were 117 or 16 murders, 21 of which were of teenage black boys. In 2018, there were 134, 24 were of teenagers in general. So it's also important
to keep that. So the stats can be twisted any way you like. However, let me throw this back at you. Notwithstanding all that, and I think it's fascinating what you've been saying, notwithstanding all that, there is no doubt that right now the knife crime element of murder in London is predominantly young black teenage boys. And so my question for you is there any racial or cultural element?
Bro, dude, he's like, come on, I agree with you. Now agree with me about the racist shit. Come on, please. Please tell me it's like blackness playing a role here. Come on, dog. Come on. I know you just answered it by saying it is actually a consequence of the material conditions. Is there an additional psychological component within black communities that have suffered so much as a consequence of, like, you know, white supremacist state violence? Certainly that could be a factor, but ultimately it is literally a factor of the material conditions. And Piers is like, but come on, just say black people are violent a little bit, you know? Like, come on, just say, I agree with you, but like say that like you have a violent culture. Don't say black people are like racially inferior, but like at least say it's like they have a racial cultural difference. You know, come on.
So what is going on relating to knife crime in young black teenage boys?
Listen to what you've just said. When you think that blackness is the most important thing to emphasize about these young men, almost half of the young people in prison in Britain, regardless of ethnicity, were in care as children. Almost half of young people in prison in Britain were expelled from school as children. When we offer blackness as an explanatory factor, as if we don't need to know anything else.
Is it irrelevant though, Akala?
No.
Is it irrelevant?
As I said at the top of the programme, or a couple of minutes ago, in the one limited sense in which it may be relevant, i.e. the idea of a kind of particular psychological self-hatred.
Look, blackness is of course relevant, dude. Of course. But not in the way that Piers Morgan thinks it is. Okay? Yes. No one is fucking colorblind. Yes, blackness is relevant in the sense that black people have been, on the virtue of blackness, subjected to dire economic conditions deliberately. Okay? That's it. That's where blackness is relevant. Piers is so fucking thirsty. It's funny because like British people are so like politely racist, you know? In America, you got yee ass motherfuckers who be like, come on, just say the N-word. Just say he is black and therefore he doing crime. But like when you listen to British people, they're like, okay, well, it's dastardly to say such a thing. But also, would you please be kind enough to tell me if you think blackness would be relevant in this conversation in a meaningful capacity? It's like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, what do you mean? What the fuck's going on here? Come on now. Blackness must be a factor of consideration when talking about knife crime, considering that it is black people indubitably causing it. Let us not look at the systemic conditions that black people have been subjected to throughout time and history.
That affects only a very particular group of young black boys and men, and then only at a very particular stage in their life.
And what is that? Explore that for a moment.
So I'm saying there is an...
He's like, yes, we've arrived at a place that I can, draw some racial agitative propaganda. So let's harp on that. Let's explore it.
Racism, essentially. And you hear this in some rap music in some senses. You see it in some people's behaviours, where basically contempt for black life, only a very particular group of young black boys at a very particular stage...
react against it.
Perhaps...
I don't even think that you need to concede on that point.
Internalize that. But we never use it in that way because that would mean a wider dialogue about contempt for black life in general. Young parents in Ghana, which happens to be one of the most peaceful countries in the world, despite being one of the most poorest, are not worried about their kids getting stabbed to death on the way to school. No. So clearly this is something specific, if we're talking about that psychological self-hatred element, to Britain and the United States and other places.
Carla, can I ask, because it was the particular point that...
Akala on knife crime. On a knife edge? Akala on knife crime. A 35-year-old author says knife crime can't be explained by race. Now, he's saying it could, potentially. That's right. Very nice.
But Alex had made his really important intervention on...
Oh, he's rocking Maharishi. Nice.
Prison sentences and increased police presence and numbers.
Yes.
What effect might they have?
On reducing crime in the long term, virtually zero. A good friend of mine, Dr. Baz Dreisinger, did a study all around the world where she looked at prison systems and incarceration all around the world. She found not one country in which tougher sentences in and of themselves did anything to reduce crime. In fact, in many ways, we can just look across the water to the United States. They may make it worse for reasons that are entirely obvious. We already have the largest prison population in the whole of Western Europe.
I guess we don't hear this side of the coin enough. And it's very easy for us to sit here, look at a bunch of statistics and think that's the problem.
Well, I think there's a number of reasons for that. I myself was the beneficiary of a Pan-African Saturday school tradition. So in post-war Britain, there were a whole tradition of essentially black Saturday schools, black-on-black education, if you will. And I was a beneficiary of that. Voices from that community and from that tradition have very rarely been heard. But coming back to the point you were making about sentencing, let's remember we've got a couple of centuries of this type of violent youth crime in predominantly white communities in Britain. What has led to reductions and solutions? At the turn of the 20th century in Manchester, it was intervention by church groups. It was intervention by community groups. It was ameliorative approaches, essentially. In Glasgow, the same thing has occurred recently in the last few years. Yet we're being suggested the exact opposite policies that have been effective in British history and white communities, both at the turn of the 20th century in Manchester and recently in Glasgow. We should pursue exact opposite policies in London.
What would you say to a young black teenage boy in London right now who might be wandering around carrying a knife for self-protective reasons, whatever the reason may be, very specifically? Well, what would you say to them?
It wouldn't be just to young black boys. As I said, it could be in Greater Manchester, it could be in Glasgow, it could be anywhere. There are a number of solutions. And I think mandatory self-defense in schools could be one of the solutions. Not because you would teach anyone to face down people carrying knives, shoot and run away with someone's carrying a knife. However, when you practice self-defense, it gives you a certain self-confidence. I work in schools a lot and I see essentially good boys carrying knives out of fear. So I think that can be one of the solutions. I think support for the scores of already existing community groups that exist in the communities we talk a lot about, but not to. I think incentivizing schools to reduce expulsions. We know that expulsion from school,
interesting that like this dynamic literally is identical in black neighborhoods in America, by the way. The likelihood of teenagers, young black teenagers, committing crime diminishes when you have when you have more after school services, when you have social programs, any kind of like communal gathering. Sports is a good one, you know what I mean? Like you have like a basketball league or some shit, you know, soccer league, basketball league. All of a sudden, the likelihood and just crime in that demographic goes down. I wonder how that happens. I wonder why that happens. I wonder why nobody fucking ever recognizes that.
PRU trajectory is basically the beginning of the former head
the exclusion then leads to
the former head of the prison service, Martin Neri, said when the 13,000 kids we expel from school, we may as well give them the prison.
I wish he was active on Twitter. You should get him on the broadcast. I found out that he was following me already. I followed him back. I sent him a DM while this was going on.
I'm not saying it's that simple. However, we could incentivize schools to reduce expulsions, looking at what the cost of the average expelled child costs the British taxpayer and spending that money to keep people in school. So there's a whole load of potential solutions beyond just saying to young people, hey.
Don't be racist, dude. Come on. Don't make that joke. Basketball, come on, bro. They're really funny, dude. Yeah.
Put down your knives.
Or we'll send you to prison.
Akala, we could talk to you a lot more about this. It's fascinating.
After school activity busing is essential too, so they can actually do the after school things. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is always an issue. This is always a fucking gigantic issue. Like walkability in cities. Something as random as like walkability in cities would have a tendency to reduce crime. Is like all of a sudden, if you have some social safety nets, you can actually access said social safety nets when you have public transport. It's crazy.